Welcome to the discussion on building the European AI future, political challenges after the European Union's AI, Artificial Intelligence Act. A bit of an optimistic title, Daniel, because we're not quite after the adoption of the Act yet, but we will have a discussion about that today. Very warm welcome. It's great to see so much interest in this topic, and so there should be, because it's an incredibly important topic to everyone's daily lives, and it's good to see more people come in. I will give them just a moment to find a seat. My name is Marieke de Goede. I'm a professor of political science. Some of my research has been around European Union security and counterterrorism measures, but at the moment I'm also Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. I will be moderating this discussion this evening and asking some questions of our panelists, our real experts, who I will introduce to you in a moment. I just wanted to, in preparing for today, I was thinking about earlier this month when the University of Amsterdam awarded an honorary doctorate to Dr. Zeynep Tufekci of Princeton University, and she visited Amsterdam. She was here and she gave an incredible lecture, and one of the things she talked about in her lecture was how she compared the development of artificial intelligence systems to the moment when cars were developed and cars started first being on the road. And she said, what you have is these cars appearing, and right now we have artificial intelligence technologies being developed and rolled out. And she said, but at the first emergence of cars, there were no roads, there were no traffic rules, there were no driver's licenses, there were no agreements really societally about how we want to deal with this. There was no health and safety regulation. What kind of health regulation or safety regulation does a car need to have for people to use it safely? There were no seat belts. Actually, some of us are old enough to remember that time. But she compared that history to the development of AI technology now. But one important difference, and she explained that also very well in her lecture, was that we can't necessarily see the inside of the technology. Perhaps that's also the case with cars. Many of us don't necessarily understand how the inside works, but she said with AI technology and recommender systems, we don't necessarily know how the system works and on what kind of principles and mechanisms the AI systems base their recommendations. So I thought that was a very interesting parallel that she drew. And of course, the European AI Act is precisely about that. It's about trying to build rules for driver's licenses, for rules on the road, for traffic signs, seat belts, and so on. And so what we'll be talking about today is what is the AI Act? What does it actually say? What political moment is it in? But also, will it hold its promise of, building safer roads, safer driving, or are there still huge questions? What does it actually mean for citizens, for companies, and so on? So first, does it give us the right tools? What does it actually mean for the position of the European Union? A broad set of questions around the AI Act. I'm very pleased to have this wonderful panel to discuss those questions with us. What I'll do is first to give the floor to Daniel Muga, who organized today's event, also in collaboration with the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. He will give us an introduction on the AI Act and some of the key principles, and after that I will host a further discussion with questions at the table with our experts, and at the very end of today's discussion there will also be a chance for you to ask some questions. Daniel is a professor of political arithmetic at the University of Amsterdam, and he's currently leading a wiki project sponsored by the Dutch Scientific Research Council called Regulate, and Regulate investigates EU governance of artificial intelligence and its relation to the geopolitical position of the European Union. So I'll give the floor first to Daniel, and after that I will also introduce the other speakers. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marika, and also from my side, welcome everybody. It's enormously appreciated. It feels like this is the first Friday with sunshine in Amsterdam, or at least below wind power 5 and no rain in months, so that you've turned up nevertheless is much appreciated. As Marika said, I'm principal investigator of the Regulate project, financed by NWO. The Regulate project basically has two premises, which also inspire what we're talking about here today. The first one is when I started this whole research that I felt it's really essential that we have public policies in place that lead us into an AI future that's worth wanting. Many of you work in this field or have to do with it in different kinds of ways, whether as citizens, policymakers, professionals working in these fields. And we have widely divergent scenarios about what that AI future might look like. I worry that we might end up in the wrong one, and that's the reason why I started studying these things. And it's clear to me that we can't leave it to corporations themselves, but we need public policy to guide us in the right direction. And then specifically, having followed the European discussion about how we should govern AI, something that I'll say a little bit more about in a second, I felt that one thing that seemed to be missing from that conversation was that Europe makes its rules with high ambitions in a global geo-economic force field that actually has a severe impact on both the rules that we make and how effective they will be. What I mean by that is that there are major military powers in the world, the United States and China, who see AI primarily through the lens of what it might mean for them on the battlefield. And that's a very different mindset than us worrying, for example, about automation of bias or other sorts of things. And at the same time, we get the feeling that the economic stakes that are inherent in artificial intelligence technologies are enormously high. Many of the world's most valuable companies work on these kinds of technologies, and there is a feeling, for right or wrong, maybe we'll talk about that Europe right now is certainly not at the vanguard of this economic development. So there's serious anxiety also in Brussels that we might miss the boat. Again, whether that is a legitimate reason for concern is a different question, something we can discuss, but we find Europe in a constellation where there are forces from the outside tugging at us that have an impact on how we give form and give shape to our AI future. So what we do in the project, just to give you a sense of where this is coming from, what we do with some of my colleagues who are also here in the room is that we investigate what you could call EU AI diplomacy, so the ways in which the European Union reaches out to the United States, to China, to say maybe the OECD or UNESCO, other bodies that try to maybe craft global rules. And we try to think about how it does that, but also how it should do that in a way that in this force field, where we're not completely in charge of our own digital destiny, we can still, in net terms, maximize the European sovereignty about its AI future, and thus maybe also then hand a modicum of control to us, to you as citizens, giving shape to the future we want. Now, Marika already mentioned the EU AI Act. In a way, that's the point of departure for what we do here. For roughly 3 years now, since the European Commission tabled a proposal for a law, a European law that should present legal guardrails for the development and deployment of AI technologies, there have been discussions about what exactly those legal guardrails should be. And there was political agreement between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council a little more than 6 weeks ago, that was at the beginning of December, of what roughly that law should look like. Now, as Marika intimated, many people at that point felt, well, okay, that's a done deal, we know what's going to happen, and now we can move on to the next phase, and that's part of what we'll be talking about today. But as it turns out, as we speak, this law continues to be so contested, even though everybody basically agreed on what this should be, that right now the German and the French governments in particular still try to tug away at the agreement that they had sort of signed off on already, trying to create space for their own fresh national AI champion companies and try to create more wriggling room for them so that they can develop these companies, maybe start to develop a real challenger to, in particular, American companies in this field. So we have our ears to the rails right now and feel that in Paris and in Berlin, there's already tugging at what felt like a done deal, and maybe one of our guests will have more to say about that. For those of you who are not familiar with what this AI is, let me just give you in very few bullet points an impression of what this is all about. What this AI Act does, this law, and we still assume that it will become law relatively soon, is that it says there are basically different kinds of AI that fall into different risk categories. And depending on how risky a particular form of AI is, we need different kinds of rules for that. There is a risk category that is considered unacceptable risk. And these contains using artificial intelligence technologies in a way that's simply outlawed, for example, for purposes of what's called subliminal manipulation, social scoring. People tend to think of things that happen in China, and also most forms, but not all, of remote biometric identification. So you walk down the street and the system has like a little box around you on the screen and says, this is Daniel, right? These sorts of things. Then there is a category with applications of artificial intelligence that's considered high risk, and that comes with quite stringent rules for how you have to, for example, check the system before you can deploy it. And that concerns, for example, AI systems that are used in education, critical infrastructure, law enforcement, migration and border management, deployment in the workplace, legal proceedings, and essential public and private services. You want to use AI in any of these domains, they're quite heavy rules. And then there is a third category, low risk, and that includes most other things. For example, if you have, say, a thermostat in your house that regulates your central heating or something, and that's powered by AI, then that's in most instances considered to be a low risk case, and there is minimal safety requirements, and then you can go and do it. The one other thing that was added was that while the European Commission had put this proposal on the table and the European Parliament and the European Council were busy deliberating about these things, all of a sudden ChatGPT burst onto the scene, and it felt like from 0 to 100 people were thinking and talking about generative AI, chatbots, but also forms of image generation, audio generation, and so forth. The initial legal proposal had been completely ignorant of the potential challenges when it comes to regulating generative AI. What has been agreed in the end, to spare you a lot of detail, is that basically the companies that develop these kinds of models, so something like GPT, for example, OpenAI, but also, say, Stable Diffusion and a whole host of other of these things, that there are relatively stringent obligations for the companies that develop system-relevant, so the particularly prominent, effectively, and most powerful forms of generative AI. Again, think of the kinds of stuff that OpenAI develops. And then there are tiers below that, less powerful and or less prominent forms of these foundation models that have less stringent requirements when it comes to, for example, making sure as a company that what you've put on the market is really safe, that you've thought through potential societal harms and these sorts of things. Now, we still assume that all of this is going to go through and will happen. What I want to do in the remaining 2 or 3 minutes is to then start thinking about, well, if we've passed this hurdle, what's next? Right? There was for years in this AI public policy sphere, people were talking AI Act, AI Act, AI Act. That was like the talk of town. What are the challenges that we confront once something like this is adopted? And there are 4 issues that I want to put on the table. There may be others that we want to add, but these, I think, are important points for discussion. The first one is that when it comes to regulating AI, the devil hides in the detail, right? Something like the AI Act sketches very general rules. It says, thou shalt not discriminate, for example. But that's not yet a legally robust rule, right? We need exact definitions of what constitutes discrimination. What do you need to have done as a company to prove that you've done your best to make sure that the algorithm doesn't discriminate, were you to meet somebody in a court and legal proceedings would start? So it's one thing to say we have a general principle. It's a completely different thing to have something that's legally robust. Who is going to make those detailed rules? There was a lot of public deliberation with our Euro parliamentarians. Kim von Sparretak from the Netherlands, for example, was very prominently involved. But the next phase of hammering out these detailed rules is going to happen away from the political and public limelight. Does it create challenges? Do we need some form of democratic oversight over these sorts of processes, or do we have confidence that they will basically abide also by the spirit of the rules that our democratic representatives had put on the table? The second one is that any kind of rule is only as good as its enforcement. And that, again, for me, is a serious source of worry. It's one thing to say, here's the rule, thou shalt not do X, Y, Z. But of course, we can think of so many rules that are in place. Thou shalt not use drugs, for example, right? Thou shalt not do many other things. And of course, if we look around ourselves, we see there's a whole bunch of rules that are flouted continuously and without any serious consequence. So how confident are we that we have structures in place that actually allow us to enforce these principles? And the question to us and also to you is, what would it take to have structures that really guarantee the level of enforcement that we want here? The third one is that there are a whole range of different ways in which the diffusion of AI technology shapes our societies. It's going to have an impact on care, what happens in hospitals. It has an impact on inequalities in society. It has an impact on how education systems function, how young people grow up, what kind of characters we build in a world that's saturated with these kinds of technologies. What that means is governing AI and building the AI future we want is about more than just having legal guardrails for digital products that may cause immediate harm to somebody in a particular kind of context. And again, the question is, do we have these additional tools in place, and are we having the conversations as a society that actually cover the whole breadth of how AI is important to us, rather than just saying, well, here are very specific products, and you want to use an algorithm to sift through CVs for a vacancy that you have. We want to make sure that you don't discriminate in this initial automated CV sifting, right? There is a scope issue here. And then the final one is an issue that I intimated already. That's about basically finding Europe's place in what I called here a fraught digital planet. Of course, it wouldn't have escaped any of us that we live in very challenging times in so many ways. We see geopolitical conflicts continuing to heat up. We see extreme geoeconomic competition when it comes to digital technologies, export restrictions of microchips, other forms of hardware. And this seems to be a climate where Europe really struggles to find a position. Do we somehow ally, for example, with the United States? Do we try to carve out a separate European space in this kind of competition? And I think that's an additional dimension that deserves thinking about beyond what rules we want here in our own jurisdictions as we try to shape the future. So these are 4 things that I want to put on the table, but of course notwithstanding other issues that you may be thinking about, as sort of like the hot button, the hot topic issues as we think about creating the AI future we want. I want to leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Delighted to be able to introduce Pegah Maham, who is sitting to my right. She's the project director for artificial intelligence and data science at the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung in Berlin, and she's interested in analyzing how this kind of technology, AI technology, is developing and how it can be governed. And she's also working on AI trust labels on fairness and robustness. So welcome. Joanna Bryson is sitting here in the middle. She's professor of ethics and technology at the Center of Digital Governance at the Hertie School in Berlin, and she actually co-authored the first national level AI principles, AI ethics policy in the UK, the UK's 2011 principles of robotics, and also contributes to many international debates on these topics. And then Lisa Vermeer, who is a senior policy officer at the Digital Economy Department of the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, and actually leading now the Dutch team that is responsible for the Dutch position on the AI Act. So wonderful to have you here, really a range of expertise. I'll start with you, Lisa, since you're really deep in the political negotiations of this AI Act. Can you give us a glimpse of what the negotiations are like? What have you seen? And what are some of the hot contested topics in this negotiation as far as you've observed them until now?
Thank you, Marika. That's a big question. So I'm really happy to be here, so thank you so much for the invitation. It's actually quite an interesting day to be here as well, because we're very near to the day that all the member states have to, well, take their final position on this AI Act. The negotiations for one of the member states, where the Netherlands is a big member state, but also very small, and it's really interesting to have seen the whole discussion evolving over the last couple of years, 3 years almost. Yeah, what it's like. As you described, the introduction of general purpose AI models, or ChatGPT, that was launched in November last year, was a major game changer. And I think it changed the whole discussion about AI in whole society, and also had this very big impact on the discussions about the AI Act. And it also made it much more interesting to be working on the AI Act, because before it was a pretty nerdy thing in the digital department somewhere in the government, and then it was regulating the technology of the future. So I think that made it interesting to be on a team. And now we're really preparing for this last battle, I would say, about the AI Act. And as it works in government policy, the less fuss, the better, because then it will just sail through.
But the battle for you, meaning that you want to see it adopted and you want to see it go to the next stage.
Yeah, the Dutch position is that we want to have the AI Act as much as possible. It's a messy law, but it's a good starting point. I don't know if someone really read through the 900 pages of. Right. It's really a result of compromise and negotiations.
And it's actually trying to regulate things unknown, right? Because some of these developments, like with ChatGPT, are going so fast that we're trying to regulate, well, the next step in artificial intelligence that we don't know what it's actually going to look like.
And in our view, the AI Act does a good thing in trying to tackle that kind of, it's quite innovative rulemaking, and that particular fact does not really contribute to the messiness, but it makes it very important that it's adaptable to the future. And I think a lot of clauses have been introduced that make it actually adaptable, and also scientific panels and advisory fora that are really important. But the messiness is really in legal clarity, and that will be a challenge in the future.
And that goes to some of the points that Daniel is raising, I think, about what it means practically, and we will talk about those more. But first I'm going to ask Joanna, I saw you nodding. You've also been involved with some of the first written principles on AI and robotics. Do you think that the AI Act, I don't know if you read through all 900 pages of it, but I'm sure you have a pretty good understanding of it. What does it deliver that you think is promising, and where do you think it's weaker in your understanding so far of it?
Sure. Okay, so I have to say that I have not read the most recent version that was finally leaked a few days ago. Unfortunately, I've been super busy this week. But my good friend and co-author, Mary Hasia, sat down and read it all. And so I've talked about it with her. But anyway, thanks for having us here. It's wonderful. Again, I want to say it's wonderful and interesting to have it in this kind of theistic context, this conversation. But churches are about the people, and this is really what we're interested in. So it's such a privilege to sit next to one of the people that is representing all of our interests, in this context. So speaking of the original AI Act, I actually disagree that we were not expecting generative AI and nobody saw this coming. I mean, we watched Star Wars, right? We know AI can talk. That was not new. And I really sometimes think, and I read this and I agree with it, it's not my idea, that the premature release of incomplete technology right at that moment may have been about trying to confuse this legislation. And I do worry that a lot of the pages are because then, as it did become trendy, everybody jumped into it. And there was a lot of weird things piled into the most recent version I've read. But having said that, the basic thing, I agree, Daniel explained about the levels that were kind of introduced. It was originally supposed to be what is it called? The risk, I forget, there's a legal term for this, but it means that it's proportionate. And then the levels were something that was introduced later to give people clarity or something, but it actually meant it was not the risk-based approach we originally wanted to take. But, so that was part of it. But the other part was that we're basically saying, look, software is a product. And so the risky stuff, not the banned stuff, but the risky stuff is really not that risky. It's important. I wish they called the high-risk layer the important layer. So this is basically when we are giving the most legislation, the legislative attention, is when it might alter your life. So like which school might you go to? What is the medical treatment you might get? Will you get the loan you've applied to? So it's not that that's particularly risky, it's that it matters more. And then, and only then for some reason, we're treating AI and software like a regular product. And so to me, the most exciting thing here is how do we handle change? How do we predict the future? It's that we are focused on the people and the process and the people that create the software. And we're making sure that they do due diligence, they follow best practice, they avoid bad practice. Now that may not sound very exciting, but what that means is it is actually super exciting. This is where human progress comes from. It's that we find out how we make mistakes, and then we do better, we keep learning. And you could have some companies that do something cheap and nasty and don't care, and they don't mind that they'll go bankrupt in a couple of years because they'll have gotten paid $2 million a month in the meantime or something. And the sector is saying, no, we know how to recognize that now. And so all that we're doing is treating something that's previously called a service as a product and bringing it into the fold of stuff we already know how to do, which is regulation. So to me, that's the vast majority of the AI Act. And then it is really important what we've banned. That is a discussion of what it means to be European. And obviously I'm not born here either, if you can tell my accent, but as somebody who's a participant and a resident of the EU and formerly a citizen of the EU, sorry, it's a sore point. That is a really big part. And the other big part, which I have been campaigning on for decades since that first law, the first net law, whatever it's soft law, is in all of the EU, for any AI in the EU, the one law that applies to all of it under the AI Act, if that becomes law, is that we must know we're talking to AI. So we cannot be deceived by robocalls. We can't have people, pretending that the AI system is a real person. So we should therefore start understanding how to deal with AI. So I think I've taken a long enough turn. I had like 3 other things I wanted to say, but we'll wait until later.
Okay. We will come back to you. Thanks. Pega, I'm going to hand over to you. One of the things that Daniel also raised is what does this mean for the European Union, right? So what does it mean that the European Union is trying to push through the first AI regulation worldwide? Will it affect the EU position? I mean, the EU is not, of course, where necessarily most of the companies that are developing these technologies are based. Can you help us a bit with that question with your expertise?
Sure, yeah. Also, thanks for having me, and thanks for this very interesting question that's also oftentimes debated. I think we have to distinguish. So when we say Europe doesn't have many of the companies, when it comes to applications, actually building an AI application that does screen CVs, it is oftentimes European companies because they understand the system in Europe. So when it comes to this part of looking at applications, what risks do we see, the high impact cases, this is about the products we have in our markets and how we want them. So I think, and we're such a huge market, like 500 million people, quite wealthy nations, so also other companies still want their products to be sold in the EU, and the compliance is not that costly. Like if you look at what you have to do, it's probably still worth it going through the compliance and still having the products. Where it becomes very interesting, and there you're right, when we look at general purpose AI models, there is a lead in the US and in the UK. Like we know GPT from ChatGPT, there's Anthropic, there's OpenAI, etc. There are also some European players. And there it is so costly to build one of these models. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, compute centers being built, and they train these models for like 6 months. So if they know that they have to stick to this regulation to be able to have any downstream application in Europe, they will not build an American model and a European model, but they will just stick to these rules. And these rules, we can like go over them soon. Again, they're not that burdensome. It's about having an incident monitoring and notification, right? In a world where there's so much disagreement about these risks, at least monitor it and then report it if something happens, so we can have a debate based on facts and based on objective facts. And so I think similar things like a risk management process, having evaluations, that's something that everyone who can build a general purpose AI model, like even the European players with like hundreds of millions of dollars, they can and will afford it. So I think Europe has a role with its market.
So do you think it might actually strengthen the position, or at least the regulatory power of the European Union? As many people have said that, for example, the GDPR, so the General Privacy Regulation, has done precisely because of the size of the market and the EU laying down some of the key rules that then also become used in other places around the world. Do you think that parallel could be interesting?
Yeah. So again, I would distinguish between the model layer and the application layer.
Yeah.
On the application layer, the rules that you can find in the AI Act, they are all covered also in the G7 Code of Conduct. That's like one of the more international rules. So they're quite in harmony with what the international community agrees is a good idea. The difference just is Europe actually can enforce them, and it's not voluntary rules, which I think intuitively makes sense, right? If it's about other products and technology, we also don't rely on companies voluntarily agreeing with it, but we say we have enforcement. So I think the same is here. And then I think of like, if this actually is the first law in place, the companies even have an incentive to argue, because the executive order is coming in the US, there's discussions in the UK as well about regulation, and if you already have to stick to the European way of doing it, even if it's not that European, it's actually quite international, you'll probably say, look, please look at what the Europeans are doing so we can like have similar rules. So it's an advantage as well, yeah.
Can I say something really quickly, because I know the audience might not know this. It's not that we imitated the G7. We have been working on this process for years. There was something called the High-Level Expert Group that put out a white paper that we've been doing this for 4 or 5 years. We are the ones influencing others. And there is now already law in China and law in Brazil that openly uses some of the text from our law. And the G7 only came to this again in the last year. So this is, we are already leading. And we had a conversation about this before. It's not just that we're a large economy. From the years 2007 to 2009 or so, the EU's economy was the largest in the world. It was larger than America, it was larger than China. And we're still comparable to those two. So we are really a large economy, and we have a large digital economy. That means we already do have AI through a lot of our products. So I don't want to understate how much, and not just business to business, really throughout our infrastructure.
So one of the key messages I hear is that it might make people worry about the position of the European Union and the competitive advantage of the European Union, but you're actually saying it shows the influence of the European Union, and that is already showing to some extent. I want to turn a bit to the sort of practical implications. So I'm still trying to get a grip of or an understanding of what it will actually mean in our day-to-day use of thermal systems or ChatGPT or surveillance technologies. Like what will the Act actually do? And partly I hear you say the rules are not that burdensome, which worries me a bit, because I worry that, are they burdensome enough? Like, do they ask enough of the companies? And partly, Daniel also talked about the devil being in the detail, right? So we still need to see how it actually works out in the actual implication, which first needs to be done at the national level, but then, of course, it means something for the products, for the companies. Can you give a sense of understanding or an example of where you think that this will really have an impact, or the impact that you expect it to have, because it's still in the future?
Well, I think the main thing to me, is it okay if I talk again? the main thing to me is that we are, and so we are ensuring that someone is responsible. So one of the things that was said before is we don't know how these things really work. And part of the reason for that was that they were being developed in with this kind of Wild West mentality, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things the EU is working really hard to ensure is that the people who are held to account when something goes wrong are the same people who actually could have had efficacy. So they could have been negligent, but either they did have efficacy or they could have had efficacy. So the fact is that the A in artificial intelligence stands for artifact. It is something someone built, and they did it deliberately. If this was like a bridge, some people say, well, we can't be responsible for software because, there's these libraries, and you don't understand. It's dynamic. The libraries, they change. And it's like, if you get a bridge built and somebody didn't pay proper attention to the concrete, the people who built the bridge are held liable for not having gone out and checked that they had a good source of concrete. Mm-hmm. And the same thing has to be true for software. So I basically expect, and we have already seen this with the Digital Services Act, which is already law, I expect the companies to reorganize themselves in a way such they produce better products so they and we both know that they're doing the right thing.
Lisa, do you have a sense or an example of what you hope this act will achieve for citizens?
Yeah, certainly. Maybe not a concrete example as you ask. I try to make it as concrete as possible, but what I really hope for now, if the AI Act is agreed in a couple of weeks, then we really, what's next is make it work. And that's not a given. So, of course, we're already influential, but it's not a given that it will work in the EU as foreseen in the law. It's just a piece of paper. And then we have to go and work with it. So one of the more inciting future scenarios for me in a couple of years is that there is a general sense of trust among people, among all of us. This trust is pretty low in the Netherlands because there have been a couple of scandals and there's this general idea of you really cannot trust algorithms and it's going to be bad for us. So I really hope that this act is the starting point of turning the tide and making sure that in a couple of years we actually do trust the integration of artificial intelligence in all kind of areas. And for example, if you apply for a job, I think that's one of the most concrete high-risk areas. There's lots of applications, sorting CVs. Now, I think most of us would say, well, if you see in a website of a company they use AI, you think, is that a good idea? Will I be selected, or will I be given any good? And I hope that the AI helps that all the developers of the kinds of AI integrate this risk approach, mitigate the risk, and do the things that are in the AI Act, that we can actually trust the fact that AI is used for sorting CVs or for deciding about what is your next step in your education. Do you get that degree or not? And all these kind of areas. So I really hope that that's the concrete change that the AI Act will bring.
But that's a very specific example, actually. Yes. The welfare scandal. One thing that should change is that you should have access to explanations for automated decisions. And then if that doesn't look fair to you, there should be a clear path of appeal to say, I don't think this automated decision was correct. So that is one of the things that is supposed to be addressed.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think the Act wants to build as well is the right to lodge a complaint, right?
That's what you said.
But I think that so often we do not know how these recommender systems work. And you might not know that something that happens to you, for example, being denied a tax credit, or what happened in the Netherlands with the tax benefit fraud scandal, you might not know that some of those decisions that the government takes about your file was based on AI technology. So how can you lodge a complaint if you might not necessarily know where some of those recommendations and decisions come from? So is the right to lodge a complaint an actual, is that actually something that citizens will be able to exercise? I don't know, are you,
I think you have to combine it with structures around it. So you have to combine it with transparency and documentation. So when I'm thinking maybe there's an application that is discriminating someone, but you don't know it. You don't know that the decision would be a different one if your gender was another one. So the only way to figure this out is by testing it. And there's like in AI, there are various ways to do it. You can do red teaming, you can do statistical tests with like controlled comparative data and see what the results are, if it's statistically different, etc. And you have to have an ecosystem that checks these new applications. It's a new way that we will interact with the world. And there is academia, there is civil society with these competences, and they can help government themselves to do it before they actually apply such AI. And then you can use this, that together with the right to actually sue, this can become really powerful. And then I'm actually quite excited about it, because then it can even be less biased than human decisions. But we have to do this.
Thanks.
Can I ask us a question?
Yeah, I think Daniel wants to come in, and then,
I think there are two additions I would like to make to that. The first one is, when it comes to the European influence in the world, I think we have to discriminate between what's low-hanging fruit and where the rubber really hits the road. If other countries copy the relatively easy to copy 90% of the AI Act that are relatively uncontroversial, they say, yeah, sure, this sounds okay-ish, we take this, and we'll see whether we'll ever implement this, whether we'll enforce this, but it looks better than nothing. I don't know whether that's getting to the core of, maybe the 10% that are really more controversial. So I think sometimes that somebody says, okay, the Europeans have this idea of different risk layers, and we see that adopted elsewhere as well. So here already see the European influence. That for me does not yet, that's putting the bar too low, I must say, as a potential signal that really the European way is something that genuinely diffuses throughout the world. The other thing is, and this goes back to the example that you gave earlier from Zeynep Tufekci about this cars analogy, right? I think it's a fundamental difference whether you say we want to ensure that the cars that are on the roads in the Netherlands are safe, meaning that they have seat belts, that they have buffer zones, that the lights work, all this sort of stuff. That's super important. But that is fundamentally different than having an enlightened traffic and mobility policy, right? So if we think about the impact, exactly the sorts of things you mentioned, what happens when we introduce the car in a society? We start seeing different kinds of urban structures. We see air pollution, we see urban sprawl, which leads to segregation among societies, which leads to civil strife, which leads to all sorts of things, right? And so, yes, having a car out there is important, and that goes back to the trust issue. Yes, I do want to be able to trust my car that, if I have a certain kind of accident, that I'll be physically safe. That's important. But there are these other things as well, and that's what has me more worried. And I think it would be unfortunate if we were to conflate the two and say, because the car is safe, we can sort of like lean back and say, we're good. So I think there's trust on the level of the car / the algorithm that we have red teams or other forms of documentation in place that maybe doesn't discriminate. But when it comes to the wider issue of trust, how comfortable are, for example, citizens that the digitization of Dutch society will genuinely be to their benefit across different societal strata, which have different levels of socioeconomic security, different levels of digital literacy, different levels of understanding this documentation. 99% of us, when we're presented with a cookie banner on our phones or something, just click, yeah, sure, go on, and there we go, right? Yes, we're given an option. We could, go through this long menu and disable all these different things, but most of us don't, right? So on that level, I feel like, yeah, there's trust in the individual thing, but there's other issues that still deserve tackling, and that seems an unfinished business.
So do you think that there's things left out of the AI Act or things not yet addressed? I think
I was just thinking maybe to give some concrete examples, because I think, you talked about maybe more systemic societal level risk, we have to tackle them too, but there are also some risks that the regulation shouldn't and can't regulate. When I'm thinking, for example, the fact that ChatGPT makes up some stuff in a way that looks really correct. I don't think we should ban it for this, but we should make sure that people know this. So we have to educate people about this. We have to make sure that there is enough transparency in these applications. We also have to educate people about what to expect from misuse. So there's already technology that people are scammed with voice cloning, where people pretend to be their children or like their parents and say, please give me now money. And it's like people don't know that this is technologically possible now. And this can not be prevented so much by regulation anymore because the technology has proliferated, there are enough bad actors doing it, but education is important here. And also with reskilling. Some parts of jobs will be automated, some people will lose their jobs, and the government should step in here and help with the reskilling.
Yeah, I think Dr. Tefeci was also making the argument that some things should just be forbidden, like voice cloning and.
Well, that is.
But you can't.
Yeah. So that's, it should of course be
There
forbidden,
should be.
and if we figure out who it was, it's of course it's fraud. I'm just worried that this is something that we won't be able to enforce fully at this point.
Right.
Joanna, you wanted to get back into the conversation as well, I think.
Well, sorry.
Perhaps there's lots of
At this point,
points.
yeah, so a lot has gone under the bridge since the original thing I wanted to say, let's see if I'm trying to think if it was relevant anymore, was that you, if you remember, you were describing about how, it should be a part of an ecosystem, this explainability component. I believe that one of the things that's changing altogether is that, and we do have to see this in a larger system, is that we do have more access to information. I think that's been one of the things that's made a challenge of governing, and part of that we can't just sort of distract people from the fact that that systems are changing things, and there are winners and there are losers. So I think that. I believe that it shouldn't be that much of a problem. That what you were saying about the nesting of the explanation. That well, how do I know if this is AI? People should know that when they get denied, if you get denied a loan or something, or you don't get into the school you want to, you say, "Show me something that I can understand." And that's when you find out whether it was AI or not. But either way, whether it's AI or not, it should be explained to you in terms you can understand how the decision was made, even if it's just that our Kita, or whatever you call it here, came to the conclusion that we flip a coin on this, and so your child lost the coin toss. That you just need to know that, right? And you have to be able to accept it. So this is really a fundamental restructuring of governance, but we should all be more informed, and we should be able to better make decisions as a consequence. These aren't just random things that happen anymore. It's something we can get an explanation if we ask for it.
Yeah. Lisa, can I go back to you? Perhaps also to have your reflection on some of the things that are being said at the table. And also, you mentioned that one of the things you hope is to have more trust in AI technologies in the Netherlands, because, also of these principles, I guess, of right to information or explainability. But of course, there's reasons why there is a lack of trust in Dutch society in some of these systems. So do you think, what else do you think is needed to bring back that trust? And will the current provisions in the AI Act really be able to deliver that sufficiently, also in the details of its implementation, which is what Daniel raised?
Yeah, well, thank you. I really don't think that one law or even all laws together can really do this, achieve this, and really build trust again. There's so much more necessary to have that, and also understanding right to information, access to information. It's a combination that is needed, but I see the AI Act as one building block that is important, and to take this goal as the founding principle of what we actually do in the government to make the law work, although that is one piece of the bigger puzzle. But maybe it's also interesting to put the spotlight on the other end of the value chain of all AI, because we're now talking about the right to information, the right to complain, and that's important rights for affected persons, as we often call it, like the people that are affected by the use of AI. But if you look at the starting point of AI, of the developers, of the AI talents that people are often talking about, or the PhDs, the students, the geeks that want to build cool stuff and to sell it eventually. In the EU, there's lots of talk about we have to keep them. And what I also hope that the AI Act does for them is that, it will work if all these developers and all these smart engineers, but also policy officers, data scientists, if for them it becomes very natural to know that when they are building tools for a certain kind of sector or certain application, that they will think of how important is this going to be for people's lives, how risky will it be to stay in the risk-oriented thing, and that they will think about this, mitigate any kind of risk, and care about data governance, and that it will actually be good for people that will be affected. So I also hope that the AI Act, because it's product law, so it's really like it's like milk jars, you know, that you can trust that the milk is fine, and you can trust that the computer will not explode, and then in the future you will be able to trust that the AI is not discriminating. I think that is very, very hopeful, but at least I hope that it will have as a result that also developers at the very, very beginning of this one idea and then starting to program, that it will be taken into account, like what will the impact be in the end. So I look at it from the whole range of like the AI developer until the affected person, and the AI Act brings something, and that's really the position of the Dutch government as well, to any one of them. And it will bring some burden, but also that's proportionate for what we want to achieve in the EU.
Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful prospect, right? And it's also what you've seen around privacy by design. And as the dean of a faculty, where actually we have also people working with large language modeling, for example, as well as philosophers and ethicists working together in a faculty, you do hope that, you know, those different people find each other at the very early stage of the development of a product or a program. And so, to sort of put it in a kind of too simple way, but I guess I could trust the geeks to take some of that into account if we also create the right conditions for that collaborative work to happen in the university, perhaps, and also outside the university. But what about the companies, right? So between the geeks and the citizens, which is just, the people that, or the spectrum of people that we're talking about right now, are these huge, powerful companies. And they will also play a role in, making sure the devil is in the details, so making sure the act needs to be implemented, the act needs to be, actually executed. And a lot of that will be in the hands of private companies and private governments. What are the thoughts around the table about that? I'm starting with Daniel.
I think one of the experiences that we have is that large profit-driven organizations do regularly search out the boundaries of what they can legally get away with, and also frequently seem to be fine with transgressing them. So if you look at, say, for example, transgressions, say, from large consultancies, accounting, auditing firms, like we've seen over the years, decades, major scandals there. Large, globally operating banks, where there are pretty clear rules about what they can and can't do. No shortage of fines has been handed out, and I'm sure that there has been transgressions that haven't even been found out and fined. Large tech companies that in all sorts of ways, have really transgressed what was legally allowed, and then have been willing to accept, that they may end up paying billions of dollars in fines, but that's okay. That's how the game is being played. So the idea that once the law is there, I think if experience teaches us anything, that we should continue to remain cautious, not just think once we have the law there that companies will automatically abide by them. That's at least not what experience tells us happens.
I would love to come in on this. And this is going to help us go towards one of the directions you wanted to go, which is the future. What after the AI Act? Although it's also a little bit of the past. There's something called the Digital Markets Act, which is about this. But every time we create a new technology, a new form of automation that really fundamentally changes the world, what this is about is power, right? The artificial intelligence means that we can sort of write down our intentions and then do them mechanically. So with the Industrial Revolution, the thing we had to do, exactly because of what you just said, because of the skill thing, was we had to invent public education. We had to make sure that everybody could get new skills, or at least families could get new skills, right? Maybe not there were some people who really came down in the world, but at least their kids had a chance of going into another new sector. And then in the 19th century, with this innovation of telegraphs and rail, and this suddenly distance didn't matter as much, we had to make something really important, and that was called antitrust. So there's two parts of antitrust, and one gets talked about a lot more, especially in the EU competition law, that we need to make sure that there's enough competing companies and there aren't these mergers so that there's just winds up in this one giant pile of power, right? But there's another part of it. There's some things that size helps them with, like telephone systems. You don't want to have 15 million telephone systems. You want one to work for everyone. And railway systems, you know, they wound up coming together, so we made these networks. These things are called utilities. And one of the things that has really not been done since about 1980 is advancing the theory of utilities, and indeed the application of utilities. So when you look at Twitter, and you look at Google, and you look at Microsoft, to me what I see is something that looks like there's some core utilities in the middle of that. Google wraps the entire globe with fiber optic cables to make their stuff work so fast and to be so secure. To me, that sounds like a utility. And it's not necessarily just an American utility, too. People say, well, this is America, but America's sort of dominating it in some ways, but the point is that this is EU talent and the whole world. The whole world contributes talent into the West Coast of the United States. The whole world is contributing data into the West Coast of the United States. And I think what might have become one of the stumbling blocks, well, first of all, of course, around 1980 was when the Soviet Empire had evidently plateaued. And so I think some people just got lazy and sloppy because they thought they won and they didn't need to worry. But the other thing is that I think these issues are transnational by nature. And so individual governments can't handle it. And I suspect that's why the EU is leading right now. We had a different set of problems. We had to figure out how a set of disparate nations that hate each other, that tear down each other's cities all the time, could come together and make things work. And now I think we can help the rest of the world see that too. So to me, one of the things that comes next is going beyond the EU and starting to think about, like maybe at the UNESCO level, transnational governance of these digital utilities.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective, and I like the term utilities, but of course there's a lot of literature on how some of these platforms and how some of these companies have become infrastructural. So I think it's around infrastructure that some of this discussion on the sort of core public value that these platforms and these companies have, some of the discussion.
We're not disagreeing, and if we are, it's my ignorance because I'm not a political scientist like you.
No, I'm not disagreeing.
Essential infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
Utilities.
Yeah. I want the audience to start thinking about whether they have any questions. Oh, I see lots of That's good. We can, and I first want to turn to you, Kate. Do you want to react to any of the things that have been said?
Jump to the questions from my side.
Yeah.
Maybe just one small remark. Because I share your observation about companies basically transgressing as their standards and not really caring about fines. I think my vision has become more balanced by chatting with so many companies, smaller companies and SMEs that really want to do good. So I share your skepticism about big companies, and I think that the approach of the AI Act with these big models, and especially that there's this approach between the general purpose AI models with systemic risks, they're pretty strong requirements for them, and then you have the AI Act to make sure that you can build on top of these models and can basically be sure that you have enough information to work with them. So there will be many different models and systems on the market built on top of their models, but also the new models. And like Pega said, there are so many applications, AI applications, that are high risk or maybe less risk that are developed in the EU. And I'm sure that most of the developers, they are happy to have some sort of legal security. They can build on top of what is put down in the AI Act, that there will be standards in the EU where everyone abides by in the end, and it will be interoperable. So I think in the end there is lots of companies in the EU that want to be compliant and make nice products. So I remain hopeful.
Can I briefly amplify that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. that because I was in a room in Zurich, I was asked to speak to small and medium-sized enterprises about AI regulation. And I asked them, how many people here like wake up in the morning, because they were all, you know, high-level companies, how many people wake up in the morning worrying about shareholder value? Nobody. But the other thing I asked them was, how many of you can tell if something goes wrong with your product, whether it's because the user misused it, because you've made a mistake, or whether a hacker's gotten into it? And they all looked really freaked out. Right? That's what the AI Act is supposed to be doing. They ought to know that.
Yeah, thanks. I see that there's a few people who want to come into the conversation. I think we have microphones. Yeah, there's Fatima. Please, when you contribute, you can briefly state your name and your background, and keep the questions relatively short. I see at least 4 questions, so keep it relatively short, and we'll take like 2 or 3 to start with. Here, the gentleman, I think here's the row of 3 people.
Yes, my name is Rodolfo. I'm an assistant professor in data-driven algorithmic systems in technology policy and management in Delft, TU Delft. And I work on system safety, so it's basically a slightly broader lens than product safety. And I want to sort of continue discussion on the role of large software companies and looking at the SMEs, the small medium enterprises. And what I'm seeing is that with the development of standards, these companies are not just transgressing, they're also thinking about how can we actually influence where the standards are going. And so to give you an anecdote here is that there's a group of SME companies on AI and healthcare that are trying, some of which are trying to engage in these standard discussions, and there's quite some thresholds there to get into it. It's not for free. And what they're saying is, well, we're the only few SMEs at the table, and this is in the healthcare context because you will see different standards in different sectors. We're the only SMEs, it's mostly software companies, and there's no doctors at the table, there's no nurses, there's no patient federations at the table. And you do hear these companies already complaining about the standards that are coming out. So I think it's really an industry politics question, like how are we going to also stimulate and invest in bringing together stakeholders to arrive at standards that are meaningful and that drive us towards the futures that we want. So I'm curious about your thoughts about this.
Thank you. We'll take 2 or 3 questions. The lady, We'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then in the meantime, the panel can give a thought to which question you would like to address.
All right. Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a junior lecturer in political science at the University of Amsterdam. And I also have a background in teaching media literacy workshops at Dutch secondary schools. At some point, Daniel mentioned the different degrees in digital literacy in society, and also when discussing the risks, Pega mentioned that one of the important things is transparency, but also education. But right now, the education landscape in the EU is incredibly fragmented, and I feel like digital literacy is not very high on the political agenda, but correct me if I'm wrong. So I was just wondering to what extent you've seen this kind of urgency back in the AI Act, and in general, where you feel like the responsibility should lie when it comes to educating about these sort of issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that
behind, there's a woman right behind. I keep missing her. That one right there, that one right there.
Thank you, Joanne. Hi, everybody. Thank you for your time. My name's Nee. I'm a social entrepreneur, and we're working to train a large language model for sustainability, white box, and open source. And my question that I'd love to hear your contemplation, I can't even speak English, contemplation on, is how can the government, public, and private sector collaborate to make sure that this technology is accessible for everyone, and not just for everyone to use, but the build is accessible. As you mentioned, computing is insanely expensive, and we can't depend on the private sector to continue monopolizing this resource. So, thank you.
Thanks. Good. We'll work with this first set of questions, and I think there'll definitely maybe time for a second round. Questions on digital literacy, on sort of the public benefits, and also on the collaborations between public and private, and how can we get all the right people around the table. Who would like to jump in with some of these questions?
Yeah, I'd happy to take the first stab at them. My impression is that the point that you made, I worry, and I think it came back in our earlier conversations as well, when we talked about the infrastructures, the utility function here, that the benefits of having these enormously capital-intensive systems centrally provided and owning and controlling them have become so important that it seems to me, indeed, we might need to have to rethink what the balance is between private ownership of them and, if not public ownership, then at least public stewardship of some form. Right? And that seemed to be partially implicit in some of what was said here. But what that means more generally, and I think that also goes to the digital literacy point, is that I do wonder whether the fundamental structures that we have in our society, the divide between public and private, the modicum of individual responsibility versus collective responsibility, how compatible they are with the potentially transformative forces that these technologies unleash. Right? So I wonder, and I realize that this is pretty grandiose stuff, but I wonder whether humanity has reached a point where, in order to live comfortably and well with the technologies that are coming on stream, the same is true for climate change, by the way, but that's a different story, they're coming on stream, whether on some levels they do require, at least in certain aspects of how we as societies are organized, a fundamental readjustment. Right, so that we make some of these things much more public rather than leaving them in private hands, and that we rejig our priorities, that we really up the ante on the degree of education that people will need to be able to successfully navigate the society in which they find themselves. And that's not just adding 45 minutes per week in elementary schools about social media literacy. That's great, but I think we need the order is much taller, and that will require more than just with messing within the margins that we have, that will require extra resources that will have to come from somewhere. That means that we need to think differently about distribution of wealth in society such that we can lift all these boats. Right? This is more than about having just a regulation, but really rethinking things up and down to do we need to have more invasive de facto taxation policies to take more from the rich to finance sustainably equal society of tomorrow. I think that's part of the conversation that we have, and keep leaving these things compartmentalized, I think, might lead us to accept and embrace solutions that are too little, too late.
Do others want to react to the questions?
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's react to questions, so please go first.
Because I was trying to sort of say this before about, honestly, besides the utility notion, which I agree with Daniel to some extent about the direction we're going, I mean, markets are very efficient if we keep them at things at reasonable sizes. And so I don't want to reduce people's innovation and intuition, and that is part of what the utility law says, that all the things that could be regulated by conventional markets should be taken away from the things that cannot. And so it's broken out and done. But anyway, but I do also agree that these things are becoming public services and we need access to them. And yet at the same time, we have to think about the ecological devastation that's being caused more by Bitcoin than by large language models, but still, what are these things actually for and how much do we actually need them? So while I agree that we need to be able to have access and things like that, I also think, I strongly encourage everyone who's thinking about low data, low energy artificial intelligence. And you know who's thinking about it? Africa and India. You know, so we ought to all be trying to get good at that and to minimize the amount of data that we have around. But having said all that, I do think, and already the platforms are providing access, you know, the platforms, these large things, are already providing some kind of access. So what we need to do is have these kinds of laws. I'm not the biggest fan of interoperability. A lot of people think it's this panacea, will solve all the problems. But my concern is that we don't want all the platforms to be identical to each other. And if you're saying that you can just switch from one to the other without even looking, that's a little bit problematic. So we have to be careful about this. But in general, Airbus was a good idea. And now this is obvious this week, right? But it was a good idea for years. Okay. We need to make sure there is sufficient redundancy and that we can have some kind of exchangeability. But I do think that we can demand certain kinds of access, but we cannot expect that every kind of access will be granted for everything. We didn't suddenly get a magic money tree, and we certainly haven't got a second planet. So, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing also this environmental element to the discussion. Is it okay if we take some more questions? Yeah. Lisa, or Lisa, you want to still respond?
I think the low data, low energy AI is a really interesting idea, but that really in Europe requires some sort of change of paradigm. Oh, don't touch the microphone. Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. I think the last suggestion relates pretty much to an initiative that was published yesterday actually by the European Commission, that they want to have more supercomputers available for startups and scale-ups to connect to it. So in the Netherlands we're looking to see how member states can also be part of that. So I hope that kind of initiatives help to increase what you said, that it's important that you have access to models, access to compute power that you can actually build and then go towards more uptake. I also think that is really high on the agenda in the Dutch AI Coalition and in INET in the Netherlands to really have this increased public-private partnership to collaborate and get more access and scaling. So I think that is very high on the innovation agenda and also very exciting to see what we can do. And then literacy was an interesting discussion to give you quick insights in the negotiations, because there was, the European Parliament had like loads of amendments of the text, like we in the Council, all the member states together also had lots of amendments to the original text, and then these texts have to be merged somehow. Literacy was one of the articles brought in by the European Parliament, that every member state should really make sure that everyone is literate, basically. Very, very high over. Well, of course, that was a bit too much. Yeah, so that was basically, literacy is in the AI Act. It's not a strong requirement, but at least it's highlighted, and I think all the member states should do something with it now. Yeah. So it's a hard question, but it's in the AI Act now.
Yeah, my co-author was very pleased with the fact that it's
good to hear.
Yeah, I didn't
we had our doubts. Okay.
Thanks. And thank you, Fatima, for showing us that sometimes it's needed to just pull the plug when technology gets out of control. I see a few more questions. There's the lady with the stripy shirt. Daar zit iemand en naast haar aan de andere kant. There's too many people.
I have a very loud voice, don't worry. I really love this unplugged moment just now. Hi, okay, I'm Julie van Etra, in this context a mastodont, because I vividly remember times before the internet, so that explains a little bit how I look at some of the discussions now. I'm very interested in this new development. I'm very happy with this panel, because you really try to drive down to the deeper levels. This is not just another set of products or techniques, it's basically a pretty fundamental development of fundamental reframing and agency. At a much more fundamental level. So I want to ask one question in that context. When you all said there needs to be maybe a more fundamental lens on what categories we're discussing everything in, so the much deeper epistemic ways in which we talk about some of the topics here, and if you talk about education or literacy, I want to hear a little bit more substantively what that would then mean. Because it's one thing to say, yeah, we have to be literate, but if you really want to say we have to develop new agency to have countervailing power, and the old demands in societies that you don't have one power pushing, that you have countervailing power structures, what substantively would that mean? Yeah. What agency would need to be developed? And my sense is that I'm not against technology, I'm actually very much for technology, but unless and until we really embrace that deeper level of thinking, we're just going to be a feather in the wind of the forces that now push these technologies in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think that question is clear. And then the gentleman on the other side of the aisle, yes, please go.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask some question. I think my question or my remark or my food for thought goes back a little bit to the beginning of the conversation about the car analogy, exactly, and my question is more about what is the definition of AI that we are dealing with in the European Union's Act, because I think that's where it lies most of the challenging issues. I'm a researcher and a consultant on digital and technology policy at Technopolis, which is an international policy evaluation firm. And I'm more of the economic side of the technology. So rather than a car, I will compare AI with electricity, because it's everywhere and it will be everywhere. So it's like, what are we considering as AI in this act? Is the application as ChatGPT, is the algorithm, is the whole systemic solution?
I'll stop you there, because I think the question is clear, and there's a few more other, but thank you for the question. There's a few other people. There's someone here. Then I think Niels, did you want to? Yes.
Hello, my name is Cosmo. I used to work in the technology industry, and I'm now studying AI and neuroscience. And I was wondering, kind of with the advancement which is going on with AI and the rapid growth of it, and also the potential of AGI, what are the mechanisms in the European AI Act that development, and are they sufficient to keep up with the pace of the technological development?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to be a moment again.
Thanks so much for this very interdisciplinary panel, which seems to be where scientists go nowadays, which is very exciting and good to see that. Hi, I'm Niels. I am assistant professor of AI and European democracies at the University of Amsterdam. And I was very curious to learn more about what you think of the role of standardization in the AI Act, because this seems to be also be a governance innovation to integrate standardization in regulation and thereby elevating private or harmonization, European harmonization bodies in legislation, and what it means for our democracies.
Thanks. If you promise to keep it short, there's someone right behind Niels. Yes, if you promise to keep it short.
Okay, sorry to be very short. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more what you mean, how you would imagine things to be transparent, because I think we know the algorithms and papers around the open source implementation. Is it for you more to know what these things were trained, or do you really expect somebody to say, for that and that reason, your CV was ignored? And how realistic is that?
Thanks. We'll have to leave it there with the questions, and I know that there's many more people who would have liked, including...
But there could be drinks afterwards.
Exactly. I hear lots of questions also about delving deeper. What does it actually mean, literacy? What does it actually mean, explainability? Will it actually give us the tools to push back in a democratic sense? So an invitation, I think, for the panelists to delve a bit deeper. We'll make a final round of the panelists, and then close by looking forward to the next steps in the policy negotiation. But Pega, please go ahead and whatever theme you want to speak to.
This is the final round, so we should both summarize.
Yes, it is the final round.
So answer questions and summarize. Okay.
Yeah, but you can pick and choose what questions you want to speak to. Yes.
So maybe, first of all, I think all 7 questions were really good questions. Maybe starting from the last one about the transparency. So I think there are various contexts where it means different things. So for example, for general purpose AI models, transparency means, and standards will define how transparent you have to be, but like, for example, if you fine-tune it with specific values, maybe the standard says, okay, you have to be transparent about what these values are, so that downstream developers understand what has been fed into this raw material model. But in other situations, transparency means transparency over the fact that an AI system is actually making a decision. So that depends on the context. But of course, if you think transparency in the sense of like, you know exactly neuron number 275 got activated, and this always means that this and this decision was made, we're not there yet. These are still black boxes. And so we have to use like input and output tests to understand this, at least for, not for all AI, but at least for these like deep learning models. And maybe the second last question, with regard to like the pace is very fast, I agree with you. Potentially in a couple of years we could get to something that people call AGI, so AI that's like on many tasks at the same level of human capabilities, and it's super interesting because it's very contested, and oftentimes people dismiss this saying, well, you neither understand AI or you don't understand neuroscience. So I thought it's very funny that you study AI and neuroscience, because that's my impression too oftentimes when I discuss it with people. And I think there's that, as I said, there's no agreement with these things. Some people are really sure that this is the end. Some people say, well, if I look at the trajectory of the development, then I haven't gotten any good reason why it would stop here. And so in this case of like us being extremely unsure, because we have never seen it before in history, where this will go, there's things such as like, as I said, incident monitoring. So you can see where this is actually going. You have evaluations. So now the world is working on actually, how can we test how good these models are? How can we test how good they can code? How good they can like start arguing, etc. So you have these evals that again standards will define. You have risk management, which again standards have to define how this process will actually work. But I think these are all things that will also help with very fast developments towards very powerful AI.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll try to go through some of the questions really quickly. To transparency, in the old days people thought transparency was open sourcing, which I mean actually seeing the code people wrote, not whatever they're calling open source right now. That is not what we need. Transparency, some people are changing the term transparency to mean legibility, right? So we're actually legislating that people create systems that can be understood. And there's two senses of understand here. So that citizens can use them well, and so that regulators can ensure that people are improving, they're following best practice, they're doing due diligence, that we can improve and do better, right? So those are the two things we're really talking about with transparency. With respect to the car thing, I prefer the analogy is actually architecture. You know, it used to be that if you had enough money, you could build a building anywhere you wanted. And basically, people got tired of buildings falling down and killing them. You know? And I feel like now we're in a situation where software is falling down and killing us. And so what did we do? If you're an undergraduate in architecture, you have to be licensed. You have to take tests, you get licensed. If you're building a new building, you have to get planning permission. After you've built it, you get inspections, you get regular inspections. I do think this is the direction that software is going, and that we should embrace that, because we've just become a really important part of what it is, of how, as you just heard, about how all society is running. So we have to be able to make sure that we're professional, basically. And then finally about AGI. You can Google my name and AGI and find a couple of blog posts I've written about AGI. But I basically feel that we're not going to make AI that's exactly like human. So if that's what you mean, basically you aren't going to bake something on silicon that has exactly the motivations of an ape. And I think that's what a lot of people are confused by. They think that if it becomes ultimately intelligent, it suddenly zaps into it's like a Lamarckian evolutionary theory, that humans are just the most intelligent thing, so it must be getting more human-like. No. So therefore, if you're talking about superhuman intelligence, I think we've already vastly exceeded that and we haven't noticed. But the point is that your calculator can do arithmetic better than you. Your chess program can play chess better than you. They don't take over the world. It's not the end of the world. So what we need to think about is how people are using these tools, not about the system itself. And then finally, if you're talking about superintelligence, if you're talking about a system that can learn how to learn and suddenly is doing this exponential explosion, right? Exponential on an exponential explosion of capacity. That is human society since we had writing, since 10,000 years ago. So all the things that you're thinking might be coming, it's happening now, and that's why we're involved in governance. And if you would like to get more involved in governance, please come to Hertie School in Berlin. Thank you. We have flyers over there.
Thank you. Let's also start with the analogy, because I like the electricity analogy a lot. I got to think about, it's also in the scientific Council for Government Policy Reports analogy with electricity, and I also think of our situation now that when electricity just came, they had all the cables on the ground, and then lots of people actually died because they were electrocuted because the cables were there, and then they decided to dig for the cables and put them in the air. And I think that we're now in the phase of AI that we actually have this damage, but then we are on the road to find the solutions, like putting it in the air or in the ground. So, which makes it sort of acceptable to see that we actually have very horrible cases of AI being used in a very, very difficult and risky way. That we're on the road at least to finding the solution. So that's has been always a very helpful analogy for me. And yeah, Godelieve, you mentioned the agency, and I think how can we develop literacy to give people more agency? I think this should be, in the first place, at the goal, at the heart of the work of companies who are developing AI. That you develop your AI to actually give more people agency and empower more people, not only the privileged few or the big companies in Silicon Valley or Silicon Desert, but really to give agency to less privileged groups, to people that are not now being excluded by technology. AI will be a force for good if it really gives more agency and empowerment to more groups of people in society. So that needs to be at the heart of the development of the AI tools itself. And then finally, if I think about transparency as well, you have transparency and as a requirement in the AI Act, like the transparency that you described very well, but it's also nice to put the spotlight on the enforcement authorities, because they have pretty strong powers in the AI Act. It's an ex post enforcement, so the oversight authorities will only be after the product is on the market. But then they can ask for a lot of information. They can really do inspections at the places. I think also look into the data sets, look into the programming decisions that have been made, to the parameters, to the values. So, and that brings me maybe to my final remark, that I really hope that working at these enforcement authorities on the AI Act will be really exciting in the future, because we need that. Enforcement needs to be very good and to the point, and I really hope that there will be a lot of attractiveness towards working at those inspections in the future, and to work with companies, do these exciting inspections and develop tools together. So
for students in the room,
yeah, and for developers. And sorry for not diving into the topic of standardization. I think we can do our next panel on that one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have some final reflections on the question?
Yeah, I mean, final reflections. The first cluster is about the words that we use when we have this conversation. And of course, AI in so many ways is a misnomer. Right, because it's neither artificial nor intelligent, and I think that was borne out of some of these things.
Fully disagree. It's both artificial and intelligent.
Okay, so let's ignore the debate. So, I don't think it's more artificial than this table is, or
no, exactly. But someone's responsible.
Yeah, sure, but like, you know, the label artificial intelligence suggests that there is a qualitative difference.
We're at final reflection.
Oh, so the final reflection then is we need to keep our eyes on the ball. And that means that, yes, we can try to summarize our political goals in terms like accountability, transparency, and all these sorts of things. But I think to retain something that feels like public sovereignty over our society, if we see that the diffusion of AI technologies shapes our educational systems, our interhuman relations, our societies, the way that we go about our political dealings in ways that we find undesirable, we should retain the right to say that and say we need somehow a course correction here, right? So there's some general principles that can be formulated, some of which may be meaningful, others may be empty signifiers, but I think ultimately it remains up to us, and then whether it falls under these labels or not, to say we want to shape the digital future that we want to shape the society that we want, and we find out if in whatever direct or indirect way the diffusion of these technologies affects us in a way that's undesirable, we should stand up and say, no, we want something different.
Lisa, what's next for the policy process? Because the act still goes to the Parliament, I think, the European Parliament. What's the next steps to watch?
Well, watch all the social media sites, and especially look at your Tutsi from your active, because you will be updated every second.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe that's too technical, but there will be a discussion on AI at ambassadorial level for the member states next Friday. And then there will be a vote and discussion maybe in the responsible parliaments, responsible committees in the European Parliament on the 13th of February.
Okay, that's really soon.
And that's the second is called for the
Oh, okay. Because the second is when the Germans are all terrified.
The second is for the governments. It's a very important date. The 13th is a very important date in the European Parliament, and then it will go through a whole translating. It has to be translated in all official languages, and then it goes to plenary vote in the European Parliament, and if the European Parliament agrees, then it's adopted.
When will that be around?
The last possible instance is the last plenary session of the European Parliament before the elections, and it will be end of April.
One burning question. How high is the likelihood that the whole thing will still fall apart, in your estimation? Is there a realistic chance of it? Because many people think that it's real, like it could still happen.
50%.
Well, how much?
50.
Wow. But could I just say something? The Digital Services Act, which is the thing that controls recommenders, is already law. The Digital Markets Act, which addresses the power concerns we had here, is already law. The General Data Protection Regulation is already law, and it's not as bad as people said. And it's a violation of enforcement every time. It's harder to reject them all than to accept them all. And so that goes back to the first question.
But so we will be watching. We will be watching, and we will be watching the plenary vote in the European Parliament. Thank you so much. I know that there have been many more questions. I'm sorry to those who didn't get a chance to ask, but there will be drinks. You can speak to the panelists. So please join me in